Hello and welcome to Creative Photo Folk, where you'll discover all the ways to be creative with your camera and editing. I'm Hayley, and in this video, you will learn how to use the torch from your cell phone and simple household cutlery to create dramatic, minimalist images. So you're first going to want to raid your cutlery drawers. I borrowed some of my mum's stuff because she is the queen of kitchen gadgets, and made sure to grab anything with unique shapes and patterns that I thought might create interesting shadows. Though considering the forks I grabbed have probably been in use for many decades, they were a bit too scratched up for this. So maybe use the good cutlery for this one. Now, I feel like I say this for every in-camera tutorial, but you're going to need a dark place to photograph in because you want your phone torch to be the only light source. Now, many of the projects on this channel are designed to be created at home, but if you're interested in learning creative techniques to use with landscapes and people, then that's what my membership, Photo Fanatics, dives deeper into. So anyway, in this dark space, set yourself up a little desk to work on and position it so it's pushed up against a wall. This will give us the option of being able to then rest some of our items against the wall. You'll then want to place a large sheet of white paper or card over the top of your desk, which will act as our background. I used a piece of white foam core for this, which actually turned out to be a mistake, because it gets easily marked, and so I had to edit out those distractions later. Plus, I don't like how the texture of it looks in my photos, because I feel like it detracts from that minimalist look I was going for. I also had the same issue with the wall, so you may want to tape some paper up there too, and you can even create a seamless backdrop by taping the top to your wall and bending it down over the table and then taping it there too, just if you have some paper large enough. So I recommend using as large a sheet of white paper as you can find. If you're trying to patch something together with several A4 sheets, you may find the seams will be problematic. So definitely try to find something white, untextured, and around A3 size, just like printer paper. Now you want to start arranging your items on top of your paper backdrop. To keep things easy, start with one object at first, and then you can add in more as you go. For ideas on how to arrange these, I do recommend checking out some reference images, paying attention to the angle of the light, the perspective of the camera, and the position of the objects. One thing you do want to pay attention to is keeping your arrangements symmetrical, as inconsistencies will be noticeable. So think about creating even spacing and straight lines, and take the time to either adjust your objects or camera position to get this right. The biggest challenge I had was getting the objects to sit in the position I wanted them to, especially when leaning them against the wall, as some objects just won't stand by themselves. You can try holding them in place, but I found this created blur from my hand movements. So it might help to rig some kind of contraption together to keep things sturdy if you find this too problematic. For the lighting, we'll simply be using the torch on your mobile phone. It's great at creating the right kind of shadows because the light is small and harsh, but unfortunately it doesn't have the greatest quality of light. Since we're aiming to achieve minimalist black and white images, we need our light to be strong enough to wash out the whites and extreme enough to cast almost black shadows. So while your torch is great for creating the right kind of shadows, it isn't strong enough to wash out the whites. So instead, I experimented with a regular LED torch, but the light from this was too bright, so it washed out both the whites and the shadows. And because our objects are metal, any highlights the torchlight created were really overexposed. This is why your photos may need some editing to get the extreme contrast we're after. And this is where lighting can be tricky, but if you want to learn more about it, then I have a whole beginner lighting class inside Photo Fanatics. Once set up, turn off the room lights and switch on your phone torch to help you see in the dark.
Hey Siri, Lumos.
Make sure your phone battery is charged so it doesn't die while you're mid-shoot. Now, before even setting up your camera, I suggest experimenting with your torch and object, moving them around to see what angles create the best light and what kind of shadows that you can throw. Holding the torchlight at a sharp angle to the cutlery will create long, harsh shadows, but sometimes this also causes the shadow to extend out of your frame. So you may need to lift the light higher to prevent this. This side lighting can also really bring out the texture of your surfaces. So just raise it up higher or bring it a little bit further away if you find this a problem. Position the light about 6 to 12 inches from the cutlery to get a good quality of shadow without washing out the highlights or creating harsh hot spots on the cutlery. And you'll also notice that in certain positions, the light bounces off that cutlery to create reflections on the paper surface. So just make sure that these are to your liking. Sometimes you may find it hard to hold your phone in exactly the right position for the shadow you want to create. So where possible, I tried to rest my phone against the wall to keep it in place for higher angles. For lower angles, I used a book stand to keep it propped in place. Now you're ready to pop your camera on a tripod because we will be using slightly long exposures. And as usual, I wished I had an overhead tripod so I could get directly above my setup, but I had to make do with my regular one by tilting the head downwards to the table as much as I could manage. As for lens choice, I tried both a 100mm macro lens and my 24-70, but I found I preferred the extra space that the wider lens allowed. The settings I used were mostly f8 for a little bit of depth, 0.4 of a second, and ISO 250, but I really encourage you to experiment with this to see if you can get a better contrast. For focus, I used back button focus, as I always recommend, to be able to get focus on exactly the spot I wanted my viewer's eye to go without getting that slightly soft focus that autofocus tends to produce and having it hunt around for a place to rest in these low light conditions. For framing, this really depends on the position of your object and the direction and length of the shadow that the torch is producing. And you may even want to play around with cropping out the object sometimes. I also created a setup where I placed 2 sturdy fake books in the background, but you could use bricks or boxes instead, and position the torch behind them to create a shaft of light for even more drama. This did light up the book edges as well, but I actually don't mind it because I think the color cast looks kind of cool. This was a hard one to get right because I wanted the camera low to really emphasize the shadow, but of course this meant I could then see the torchlight in the background. So I had to raise up the camera and point it downwards while holding the light a bit higher so I was able to crop it out. I placed a long spoon across the top of the books so I could use this to rest my main subject against so that it was suspended upright. So here are some photos I took, and rather than me telling you, I encourage you to try and figure out where my light and camera were positioned. If you're not sure, just ask in the comments below. Now, editing these was actually pretty simple, and in some cases I was even able to go straight out of camera. But there were shots like this one that I just figured were going to be unusable because all these marks just kind of ruin the minimalist effect. But as you can see in this before and then after, a little bit of editing makes a world of difference in some cases. And I was able to achieve most of these edits with Lightroom. So the first thing you may want to do, and I did this in pretty much 80% of cases, is make your image black and white. So that's really easy to achieve in Lightroom simply by pressing V. But you also may now want to play with the tones. So we'll just play around with our sliders a little bit just to try and really emphasize that contrast. So we'll bring down the highlights just a little bit because they were just a touch too hot at the top. We'll take a look at the shadows. And so it's really to taste. We're just really trying to emphasize the contrast, the whites and the blacks. And sometimes you can even play with these color sliders just to even out that tone a little bit. So next I just want to crop this a little bit to make the symmetry a little bit better because these lines aren't quite meeting up. So I'm just going to load my crop tool here and then bring in this bottom just a bit until we've got a sort of similar sized triangle on either side. So about there is good. So one thing I didn't do much, but I did it a couple of times, so I'll just quickly show you, is to load the gradient tool with your masking icon. Then we'll go to linear gradient. Since the light is at the top of the image, we're going to try and add some light to the bottom too, just to even out the tones. So all I did is I put the start of the gradient down the bottom here and then just pulled it up to about where I think it should be, so roughly there. And then I'll try and bring up this exposure a little to try and match the light at the bottom with the light at the top, and then perhaps bring down those shadows a little bit as well. So that's something you could try. I kind of like the gradation of light, so I didn't really do it on too many unless it was actually problematic, because sometimes the shadows tapered off in places I didn't really want them to. So I will reset that. Next, we're going to clone out any distractions. So we'll start in Lightroom, and if we have any problems, we'll head over to Photoshop. But to do this, you want to load this little icon here, which is the new remove tool. You can use the remove, the heal, or the clone in here. I'm going to stick with the heal just for the time being. And what you want to do is make it just big enough to cover the size of your little problem spot and then click once. If you don't like what it did, you can move it around to sample from a different area. And then we can just do that all over the image for any little problem spots. Sometimes it just won't show you, but you're just going to kind of have to trust that everything is okay. So I just drew over every little problem spot. As you heal the bigger ones, you'll notice some smaller ones will start to show up. You don't have to just dot it. You can actually draw a little shape. Let's try these two. I think they were a little bit problematic, but let's give them a go. This was the one that was more problematic. So I actually found for these kind of edge ones that I normally had to fix them in Photoshop. So I'll just make sure I've cleaned up most of what I wanted here. And then I'm going to go to Photo, Edit in Adobe Photoshop. I will still use the clone stamp tool, so I'll just add a new layer with the Add New Layer button. Then we're going to load the clone stamp tool, which is S. And then I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, and I'm going to Alt click to tell it where to sample from. So Alt click, and then I can move the sample over where I want it and just paint. That looks okay. Now, the other thing you can use in here if you didn't want to do it in Lightroom is your healing tool. So I just use the spot healing tool, and I can just draw over, it looks like a little bit of a hair there. Draw over these little sections to get rid of them. I find this way easier to use than any of the cloning tools in Lightroom. So if you want to save yourself a bit of time and hassle. And now you can see that it is actually looking a bit more of a usable photo than it did when it was in its before state, which looked like this.
And that is how you create striking shadow photography using just your phone torch and some cutlery. If you enjoy finding ways to practice lighting using the simplest of light sources, then in my next creative photography class called Neon Nights and Sparkling Lights, I'll be showing you how to create exciting photos with everyday light sources, like candles, neon, sparklers, lamps, fairy lights, projectors, and device screens. And we'll also be taking a look at how to use high and low key lighting. So join us inside Photo Fanatics to catch that one. But until then, give this project a try and be sure to share your creations over in our Facebook group linked below. Catch you next week. Happy creating.